柯老师来介绍他今天要讲的内容。
你挡住了。
首先，你们要英文还是中文？中文啊。So, who has heard of game theory? And I don't mean how to play computer games. That's a different theory of how to play Warcraft and such. How to play games of strategy. Have you ever heard of this context of game theory? So game theory is actually used in economics, business, and actually we can use it in electrical engineering and computer science as well. It helps us analyze the strategies that various players or actors in the game can use to manipulate the outcome or how much they have to pay for resources. And today we'll talk about how game theory can be applied for sponsored LTE MBMS. These are multicast broadcast, multimedia broadcast multicast services and D2D services. So you may ask, why do we care about game theory and these services? So one of the biggest issues which we face when enabling multicast is essentially, how do we convince the service provider to enable a service? Well, so multicast, it actually uses resources, even if no one watches, let's say, a TV channel, it still uses resources. And radio spectrum, or the pinpool, is actually very expensive. It costs millions of dollars to even get a license in the United States to actually use a part of the spectrum. So a service provider does not want to provide a service unless you can tell them they will earn money. And this actually leads to some interesting issues. So typically, if you see mobile TV requires typically multicast services. There's NBMS. Local advertisements also is multicast, or D2D, or just sending information to people. It's not free. Even though it may be free to you, it's not free to the service provider. So we can actually use D2D to analyze how we can actually achieve two different goals. Not just how we can help the service provider earn money, but also how we can improve the quality of service or quality of experience of the end user, which actually ends up improving the service provider's revenue. Service provider, if you've read enough research, you may hear MNO, mobile network operator. It's actually the same concept. It's just, we call it service provider here because it's easier to say than MNO. So, if we see here, back around LTE 4G era, we had this concept of eMBMS. eMBMS is an enhanced multimedia broadcast multicast service. FeMBMS is an evolution on that, which supports more mobile TV services and higher density multicast services. And then 5G multicast. My research lab is actually currently looking into 5G multicast as a topic. 3GPP, which is a standards body handling 5G and 4G, has not fully developed multicast yet. Now, where you may have heard of eMBMS is in the context of IoT, Internet of Things. If, let's say, you have a smart home and they'll broadcast information such as temperature, lights, power, all of that's broadcast or multicast. Or if you use D2D devices or V2X, these are also multicast services. But none of it is actually free. They all use spectrum. So we have to ask, how can we convince the MNO or service provider to enable these services? So first, let's review what is NBMS. So the original 4G MBMS said we have a fixed resource block allocation. We have a fixed amount of resources that we can use to broadcast from the base station, or GD type, to our cell phones or mobile devices. And we multicast to a group. Typically, the multicast requires we have a common modulation and coding scheme. So in effect, this means we can't hope that someone's, let's say, channel conditions that are worse than someone else will actually, if you want to ensure they can receive the same signal, we have to use the lowest common MCS or coding scheme. Otherwise, it cannot be coded. What this effectively does is it limits our spectral efficiency or density of data or bit rate that we can achieve in a multicast group. So, if we look at an example of how video and service providers can impact multicast, an advancement on eMBMS was LTE MOOD, which allows to dynamically reallocate resource blocks. The net effect of allowing us to reallocate resource blocks is we could effectively improve resource utilization, saying, let's say you and your friend are watching baseball. Now both of these will be unicast flows, but if it's both the same stream, and so the source data is the same, and the coding that we need to use, the MCS or channel code we need to use, is similar enough, then we can convert our unicast flows to an NBMS flow. The end result is to save resources of the service provider. So once again, this is an incentive to provide NBMS services. Now for D2D, if any of you have studied V2X, Vehicle to Everything, or IoE, Internet of Everything, typically it uses a D2D or device-to-device concept. This essentially lets devices communicate directly with each other versus going through a base station. So they can be in coverage, as we see here, or out of coverage. Or they could be in a partial coverage scenario where one is in coverage and one is not. Now, D2D is actually an extension. D2D is an extension of NBMS, as it essentially allows us to groupcast. So we don't just broadcast the entire cell, we send to a subsector of the cell. And with groupcast, two members of that group saying, those of you that are interested in this, welcome to this data. If you're not, you can ignore it. So the benefit is, with groupcasting, we can reduce the amount of resources required on a cell phone. You don't need to listen to all the transactions, just the ones that say, new group, and does this data matter to me? It's actually a similar concept to Ethernet. Now, where does game theory come in? So, in game theory, to simply put it, game theory has the concept of players, or people that are competing for resources, and instead of them being purely optimization based, they're rational. They don't just consider they don't just consider how to maximize their utility, but what other people's or other players' strategies will be and how to react to them. Now, rationality is a very interesting concept because it says we need to consider how other members of a game will try to manipulate it for their advantage. So they will 他们会竞争，彼此竞争，看哪里可以做讲话，应该玩什么策略。Now so game theory lets us analyze behavior of players and their interactions, saying what behavior or actions or strategies can they use, and how are their interactions modeled. And it helps us design solutions which allow for efficient, practical, and robust solutions. So I think, to give a good example of what game theory is, let's say, for example, you and a group of friends were to buy a pie, apple pie or cherry pie, and you'd say, how do we cut this pie? Now, if you want a fair resource allocation, then you'd say you want to cut it into even pieces. So essentially n people, n pieces of a pie, all the same size. This maximizes your fairness. But with game theory, you could say, well, what if someone wants to manipulate this game a little bit and say, okay, I decide what the cuts are, and then I choose which piece I take. This actually can result in suboptimal solutions. So typically, a solution we have for discussing how to slice a pie would be, say, person A cuts it and person B chooses which piece they want first. That way, there's no incentive for person A to try to under-allocate a slice of pie. So this is a simple example of game theory. Another example I can think of is, let's say you wanted to play in stocks, for example. You wanted to understand how the stock market worked. You would say, well, what if someone buys at this price and sells at another price? How does it manipulate the prices everyone sees? So you could analyze it and say, when's the best time to buy a stock? And actually, economists will use game theory in this context, but typically it requires a lot more data than our simple examples here. So from our engineering world, how do we actually formulate a game? What does it represent? So if we think of a system as essentially having resources we want to allocate, we can then perform resource management for this. We can actually then formulate this as a resource management problem. Now in the cellular context, the user devices, like cell phones such as iPhone, and infrastructure such as GD-type or base station, can be seen as players. They essentially compete for resource allocations. One is trying to optimize the system's objective, which is a base station. The other trying to maximize its quality of service. Operations they can perform within the actions and strategies, such as what SINR if I report back to the base station. If I report a worse SINR, do I get more resources based on how the base station reacts? What allocation takes place based on the base station's behavior? What are the interactions, as in game rules and resulting outcomes between each of these players? And what is the system and individual performance, such as utility of the system versus a group versus a player? So if you're a mobile network operator or a service provider, obviously you want to provide, let's assume net neutrality, so all data is equivalent. Then you want to provide fair service to everyone, making sure no one uses more than their fair share. That's your goal. But if you want to have a guaranteed minimum bit rate, then this leads to strategic manipulation where someone could say, oh, my SINR is lower than expected, so give me more resources. That way you can achieve a common bit rate. But that ultimately can be suboptimal if that information is manipulated. So in this context, we start asking, how can we actually, with a system in play, users interacting, and expected behavior for allocation, how can we prevent selfish or self-centered behavior and optimize the overall system goal? So incentivized resource management actually facing multicast services are items such as efficient resource allocation. So centralized resource allocation can inherently achieve a more efficient allocation. But for those of us in computer science, we know it also is unfortunately leads to an NP-hard problem. Now, if we move to distributed resource allocation, we can then achieve suboptimal but more tractable solutions. So this is another aspect to consider when modeling our system. How do we enhance QoE or QoS of the end users? So QoS, we think of bit rate. What does QoE represent? So QoE, if you think of video, a simple example is, all right, so I assume all of you watch YouTube to some extent or some video platform. How do we measure quality of experience? Well, quality of experience says what's the bit rate of the video and is there a buffering event? So if you've seen YouTube, if there's a buffering event and you say ka, it gets stuck and doesn't play smoothly, you're very unhappy very quickly. But if the bit rate is low, such as instead of being HG, just standard definition, you can accept this. So obviously from a mobile TV perspective, one thing we need to consider is how we can maximize quality of experience or ensure that we reduce, let's say, buffering events and every channel gets some minimal quality that people consider acceptable. And what's the impact to other multicast services or spectrum? How do we incentivize a service provider? So multicast services, typically, if it's considered free to air, such as mobile TV or I think here it's what, DVB, digital video broadcast. With these free to air structures, you can't really charge end user money because they're not your subscribers, they're just watching it. Who do you charge money then? If you can't charge the end user, you can charge the advertiser instead. Say, it costs you money to use our TV station. And this money can then go to the service provider and say, if you enable the service, then you can earn money from the advertiser. And actually, this model is how YouTube and Facebook and other companies actually exist. You think YouTube is free, but reality is, if you're an advertiser, it's not free, it can be very expensive. Every 1,000 views of YouTube advertising actually does cost advertisers money. And they actually keep track of this. And we can use this concept again with mobile TV to say, how do we enable mobile TV over LTE and convince the service provider to enable this service and say, why do we care about this? Well, okay, so now you're all very young relative to me and some other people here, but back in the 1980s, they had this whole VHF, UHF TV concept, essentially 800, 700 megahertz. That spectrum is used for transmitting terrestrial TV or antennas. So you'd see you'd see rabbit ears on top of a house just to receive TV signals. Now it's different, but the point is that it was analog broadcast and used spectrum. Was it efficient? No. How does TV transmit now? It's all digital. So you don't need as much spectrum. So there's an incentive to migrate away from this analog TV transmissions to something like LTE or similar solutions which enable us to transmit mobile TV over a digital medium instead. It compresses better. It's more efficient. So this optimization problem then becomes, how do we consider rational decisions of the end users? How do we have tractable computational complexity while addressing computative profit concerns? Obviously, we can't achieve a 100% optimal solution in real time because that's NP hard. A knapsack is a knapsack is a knapsack, and it all takes an indefinite amount of time to solve. So obviously you need a solution which can be done in real time for advertisements, especially if the advertisers pay with the expected headcount or impact or audience watching the advertisements. And how do we address resource constraints? This ultimate problem leads to economic frameworks for resource management. Now, I know when I was doing my PhD that my advisor pretty much wasn't interested in this, but really, if you want to enable multicast services for LTE or D2D, you really have no choice but to incentivize the service provider to enable it. Otherwise, all this research we're doing is just a waste of time. So you need to convince them and say it's worth it. Now, initially, this talk was scheduled for around, let's say, 2+ hours, but I'm not 100% certain we'll get through all these topics. So I think today we'll end up discussing mostly, I think, probably the second topic, and first, second, and third topics definitely. So the first two are dealing with NBMS services, and the third topic, LATRAM, is actually D2D. So a coalition essentially is, how do I combine my resources with someone else so we can achieve something that we can't do by ourselves? So for example, you and your friend want to, you have $5, your friend has $5. You want to, let's say, buy something that costs $7.50. This is US currency. Neither of you can actually buy it, you don't have enough. You combine your resources, you can buy it and split it. So this is a coalition concept. So for our first work, we discussed Dynamic Resource Allocation Framework for MOOD, or MBMS on Demand. So what does FE-MBMS actually have that E-MBMS does not? Well, it supports this MBMS on demand concept. So increased MBMS cell capacity, so essentially we can use more than just the default. So for those of you not familiar with the various 3GPP specs, for a given amount of spectrum that a base station has, only 60% of it can be used for multicast services in release 13 and before for 3GPP. So all of your LTE cell phones can only use 60% of the available resources. But actually, with release 13 and above, you actually can do more. You can use more resources. So let's first discuss scalable video coding. Now, for those of you that are interested in video, it's a very interesting topic. You don't need to transmit all the same bits, all the same bit rate. You can transmit either multiple layers or in bursts. So if you've heard of scalable video coding, the way it works is it takes what was one monolithic layer of video and cuts it into multiple layers. So if you have more bandwidth, you can get higher quality video, but if you only have basic bandwidth, you still get base layer video. So in this context, with SVC, you say only the basic bandwidth, you get base layer. You have more bandwidth than enhancement layer 1, enhancement layer 2. What this does, in effect, is you can have a higher resolution video, you have more frames per second, you can have a clearer picture. So the edges of things are more clear, not as fuzzy, or you can see the center of people's eyes versus a blur. Another technology you've heard, which is similar, is called DASH, Dynamic Adaptive Streaming, or HTTP. It uses a similar concept. It's not multi-layer in this context. Instead, it pre-calculates how much to send, and then sends bursts of video based off feedback. So you have more bandwidth, it sends out more rich stream. But it's very short seconds, like 2 milliseconds, 2 milliseconds. So in this context, it actually allows you to adaptively adjust what's received. But SVC actually existed before DASH. So this actually leads to something referred to as a MAC layer, or resource block transmission time interval resource allocation algorithm. So video frames actually transmit at about, one video frame needs to transmit at about 1/30th of a second to about 1/24th. This is standard video, not high speed video. So like standard TV, like TVBS, is about 20, maybe 30 frames per second. Maybe slightly slower, but it's still. So essentially it means we have a set of resources we can use, and there's a deadline to use those resources by. We transmit a video frame after its deadline, it has no value, because you can't decode it. It means nothing. So previous work dealing with, let's say, video transmissions actually resulted in a MAC layer resource allocation, ended up using integer linear programming. Integer linear programming, actually, if you haven't heard of this, it's fine. Just think of it as essentially a knapsack problem. It's essentially the same in difficulty. You can actually use integer linear programming to solve knapsack. So if you've heard of knapsack, that's good enough. So if we allocate every single MAC allocation period resources, using integer linear programming, this requires a lot of time. And it's not good for real-time resource allocation. Now, why do we care about real-time allocation? Well, A, live TV is real-time. B, our radio resources aren't stable for long periods of time. They change with time. So if the radio channel becomes, let's say, less stable, 品质比较差, SNR 比较低, so 无法传那么多资讯. We can't use the entire bit rate. We have to adjust. So obviously, something that's faster than NP hard is desirable. Otherwise, it may not be useful. So YouTube is pre-recorded, but if you watch on YouTube, let's say TVBS, which is broadcasted live, that's not pre-recorded typically. That's broadcast live. So it's real-time resource allocation based off of bit rate. So how does this connect to LTE? Well, LTE has this concept of MAC layer allocations. So you can see here we have a resource block, and then it can be broken down into symbols. So here it says 2 slots of resources actually constitutes 1 subframe. And we have 10 subframes per 1 frame in a LTE radio transmission. So let's say you had 10 megahertz of bandwidth allocated. Then you have 50 resource blocks. Now what this effectively means is you have 50 of these red things here. You have 50 resource blocks, each with a different potential capacity based off the radio channel quality. So it means it's not monolithic. Each resource block could have different properties. Even if we consider frequency flat fading, that says it's the same quality across frequencies, that's only for that given allocation period. So typically, how do we transmit SVC video? Well, we'd have to allocate the video into multiple groups, or video groups. So if we see here, this group 1 has 2 UEs that are receiving this video. Group 2 has 2 UEs, or user equipments, receiving this video. And group 3 has 2 other UEs receiving video. It's effectively 3 different groups competing for resources to receive their video. And they all want the best quality they can receive. But how do they tell the base station how do you tell a base station what you can receive? It's not, I'm interested in this, I'm interested in receiving some video stream and that's it. You have to say, what's the channel quality between the base station and me? So good channel quality says I can receive more, bad channel quality says less. So our allocation problem then reduces to determining a utility maximizing allocation, or reallocating resource blocks among video groups. So essentially, we now have multiple groups of videos and users competing for resources. So you can see this is a problem. Now, how do we actually measure quality of experience? Now, this equation we see here is not standard. It's actually based off data mining. So every single video program and audience would have a different equation. So what we see here is just a result of data mining some soccer game from many years ago. But essentially the point it has is, as your buffer ratio increases, as you have more stuttering events, utility or interest in a TV program drops by 3.7% by 3.7 minutes for every 1% increase in buffer ratio. Note how the buffer ratio has a larger impact in utility than the bit rate. So bit rate is a secondary aspect of quality of experience, not a primary. So this equation here, while it is, if we just use it as a application layer version, then it doesn't actually capture the radio channel characteristics. This is where we need to actually translate to MAC layer to a macular simulation. Now this QE metric, I said, well, what? It depends on your interest in the program. It actually has a terminology, user engagement. How long you are engaged in the TV program you're watching. This isn't politics or something. It's just how long people are willing to stand waiting for. People hate waiting. That's pretty much the point. And so for every 1% increase of buffer ratio, decrease of watching for 3.7 minutes, average bit rate increases 20 kilobits per second, that increases engagement by 1 minute. So you see, you can't, if one person maximizes their video quality, it could adversely impact another TV channel. So ultimately, this becomes an integer linear programming problem. Or you can think of knapsack, the same thing. And because each resource block is considered essentially a different weight. When you think of a knapsack, when you have different weight items, you can put in a knapsack. So each resource block actually says, I can hold so much, certain capacity. Say, which video do I put in there? Is that going to put one video? The question would then be, how do I allocate my videos among those resource blocks, which all have different capacity, to maximize utility? What's this? It's an knapsack problem. So, in addition to capacity of resource blocks and allocations, we also have the SVC video layer size limit. So you don't allocate resources to someone that can't use them. You already transmitted your video layer, there's no point to give more. So by having B here, this actually says AX is less than or equal to B. If you think back to linear algebra, that's essentially what this problem is in terms of saying integer linear programming and resource allocation. And so our constraints here are essentially one resource block or one video group per resource block, and number of resource blocks allocated is capacity dependent based on our video layer transmission. So we already know integer linear programming is actually not a tractable solution because it's NP hard. What can we do? So one advantage of having insight into your data, which actually you'll see this when you start working in AI research and machine learning, you'll see that once you start to understand the nature of data, you can extract trends in it, or in this case, a gradient. So data that is well behaved, you'll find it has gradients in it, and then you can exploit that with heuristics and obtain solutions that are near optimal in a much more tractable period of time. We see this in machine learning and AI as well. It's just here we just talk about video instead. So the video layer size as a constraint is unnecessary. In fact, if you think about integer linear programming, the way it works is a constraint only has meaning when it limits your solution space. So if you're allocating resources and you haven't been a constraint yet, it doesn't impact your solution. The key difference is the video layer size should only act as a usable resource block capacity limit. So instead of saying, using integer linear programming to say you cannot exceed this, just say you can exceed this B. You can allocate more resources, but you won't get more money. You won't get more utility from it. So integer linear programming will avoid exceeding a capacity or constraint. But with a gradient, we can be more flexible and say, you can exceed the constraint, but now it doesn't help you. In this context, you can then actually have a solution that is suboptimal for every other user, but actually ends up letting one user finish their video transmission, increasing the overall utility. So what we're assuming here is, if you receive a partial video frame, your utility ends up being 0, so you want the entire video frame. Thus, finishing your video frame and first versus waiting until everyone else is done actually is a better solution. So the impact is ILP deprioritizes resource allocation due to optimization, saying integer linear programming in general says, I want to maximize my utility by walking up the steepest gradient possible. If you've studied simplex, you'll notice it does the same method. It says, which direction should I go which maximizes my utility the most? Gradient just says, we limit this utility to usable bits, because we know if we finish a video layer, we actually realize that entire utility. It's not just potential utility. Say you transmit 99%, but you're still missing that 1%, so that's nothing. You realize your utility that says you've just gotten your 3.7 minutes gain, or however you interpret it. So gradient finishes groups with partial resource block demands, which has the largest impact utility first, while ILP does not. Is this a problem with ILP? No. This isn't an issue with integer linear programming. It's a problem. Issue is the problem space itself doesn't lend itself to having to letting us. It doesn't permit us to easily capture in linear programming terms how we should address this problem. So that's why gradient actually can achieve equivalent to or better than ILP. And we'll see this in a moment. So for comparison, we'll see graphs here shortly. For comparison, baseline, it's essentially we assign a number of groups and it's proportional. So more users in a group, more resources, or some fraction thereof. Its complexity is big O of V. Only one. Very simple. It's obviously suboptimal. Round robin, which says essentially in this time slot, we allocate all our resources to you. Next time slot, next group. From an operating system's perspective, it's fine, but it doesn't lend itself to an optimal solution for video coding. This is also big O of V. Throughput optimal is an MCS or population-based coding. This maximizes QoS. This is a polynomial time execution, but unfortunately, it's not aware of the SBC video characteristics that say it's multiple layers. Base layer is important, the most important. Everything else is just essentially dafun, or extra points. Water filling, on the other hand, essentially says, this actually is a thing, my senior classmate actually used water filling for his method. This actually doesn't yield a better solution. It just is SBC aware. It says allocate based on the demands of the users and who has the least demand first. Now, integer linear programming, we already know this is optimal, but it's optimal only to a point, and it's still going to be hard. We know that if it doesn't transmit an entire group, integer linear programming will in fact fail to achieve an optimal solution. It can underperform. But gradient, on the other hand, can achieve results similar to ILP, but running polynomial time. And actually, can you see that back there? I hope. Okay. So, if we see here, this line at the top here is ILP and gradient. So the diamond is gradient and the red dot is ILP. Notice that as the number of channels or resource blocks increases, the utility for ILP outperforms and gradient outperforms every other utility we have here. So other standard metrics of baseline, throughput-oriented, water filling, and round robin all fail to meet the same quality criteria. But if we go ahead and look at, let's say, number of video groups, when we increase the number of video groups or competing groups for video resources, we can see actually integer linear programming, it performs similar to gradient, except when we have more groups than we can handle. Then it can actually outperform gradient. Does this mean gradient is worse? Not really, because when you actually look at a the standard scenario where you only have a set number of channels. Let's say, in this case, we have 4 channels. If the group size increases to, let's say, 10, what's the net effect? It decreases the common channel capacity for each device, because some may have worse channel conditions, some may have better, but as you increase nodes, it tends to decrease. And as you can see, ILP here and gradient actually have similar performance. So we can also see, if you look at number of video layers transmitted, that actually gradient on average will transmit more video layers than ILP. In every scenario, we see gradient actually is more sensitive to the fact that data needs to be transmitted completely, while ILP is not. So, by understanding the nature of data, we can actually design the nature of the data we're transmitting. We can actually design more efficient methods to transmit video data in tractable, real-time manners versus NP-hard. Now, the next work we have here is dynamic resource allocation and advertisement revenue optimization for a TV over eNBMS. This is mobile TV. So we assume here people actually do watch mobile TV on their cell phone. In some scenarios it makes sense. I think the industry actually has realized many years ago they can't have the same content as terrestrial conventional TV because end users won't pay for it. So for mobile TV, what do we need to actually support this? It's standalone eNBMS, increased NBMS cell capacity, non-collocated multi-carrier support, and TV reception without authentication. So what do all these technical terms actually translate to? Essentially, we want to be able to support mobile TV, we need to be able to use more than 60% of a cell for capacity. We want to support standalone eNBMS, so you can connect to it without a unicast carrier. So typically, when you connect to a multicast carrier, you're required to have a unicast carrier as well, so you can actually talk to the unicast carrier and get the information to decode the multicast carrier. But with standalone eNBMS, this is not true. With standalone eNBMS, all the information you need to decode the eNBMS stream is self-contained in that multicast stream. Non-collocated multi-carrier support would essentially say you have one communications company that provides a TV service, and it's not your company. So, for example, Yuanchan provide a TV service, but you're Zhonghua Dianxin. So, by enabling non-collocated multi-carrier support, you can essentially say, you know, I don't need to be a subscriber of that service. Why is this important? Well, many TV programs are required by law to be free to everyone. So, emergency broadcast, news, these type of things. If you're in the US, there are certain TV programs that need to be free to air. Now, free to air has certain requirements, one of which is you can receive a TV signal without authenticating. This means it's just you receive only, you don't transmit. So, the typical TV you have in your home, well, not now with the set-top boxes, but 20 years ago, those TVs just received data, they didn't transmit. And how they do this is they knew, well, they didn't need to authenticate with the service provider. They just had it for free. So typically, mobile TV actually can actually be deployed over NBMS. And actually, this was one of the driving reasons behind NBMS development was mobile TV. If you're curious which company pushed this for many years, it was Qualcomm. Qualcomm in an attempt to, I guess, sell more chips, try to push MBMS from 3G to 4G to 5G. I think eventually it'll take hold, just only when it's efficient enough, but we're getting there with 5G. I think we're actually near the point where MBMS will be more common. So typically, for mobile TV, there's multiple TV channels. So for example, let's see. Actually, I don't think anyone here has a cell phone that supports mobile TV from years ago, but it's typically, if you were to think about it, like you see on YouTube, you switch from one channel to the next to another. What if those were transmitted instead over YouTube? They're actually a separate application, and they're free to everyone. So YouTube requires you to have a subscription with your service provider before you can access data. But with mobile TV, you could say, well, okay, I can legally watch it for free. So how does this work? How do we actually support this economic model? Is using subscription-based revenue generation. This is originally subscription-based revenue generation. You want to watch a TV channel on your cell phone, you have to pay for the service. So, it seems logical. You pay money, you get service for this. But this didn't succeed initially. So why is it mobile TV failed in the past? One part was separate spectrum. So solutions such as terrestrial DMB, media flow, and SDMB, these required separate radio spectrum. Now, what did we say at the beginning of our discussion or talk today? Was radio spectrum is a very precious and expensive resource, and service providers do not want to waste it. Another reason for failure was it required separate hardware. The initial DVB handset and similar solutions required dedicated hardware to decode the video. So this is not significant, except it's a cell phone. Do you really think every cell phone wants to spend more money to install hardware that's application specific? I don't think so, and typically they don't want to. And that actually was the reason behind essentially requiring that there's no separate hardware for mobile TV reception. It actually was also the push for LTE and NBMS to be combined. So the first three dealt with common radio spectrum and hardware. Number 4 is more of a content issue. So typically, mobile TV failed miserably because it didn't target content for mobile TV viewers. People that watch, let's say, TV on their cell phone, you're waiting for, let's say, Gautier or a bus. Do you watch a long TV program on your cell phone? No. You watch maybe something like, you watch a short thing such as Daily Motion or some short video on Facebook. These are very short videos. They're not the same as full-blown TV programs. They're different content. That was another reason for failure for mobile TV. And the last one was subscription cost. Who wants to pay money for a TV service that they rarely use and that actually has the same content as they have in their home? No one. Why pay twice? So initially, the initial model we found for this many years ago was essentially advertisers would send their advertisements to content providers that would then integrate them and send the video stream to a service provider. The service provider would then broadcast this over their ENOB or network to end users. Now, what you see here is advertisers who pay money for their content to be transmitted to potential consumers pay it to the content provider. They don't pay it to the service provider. And the service provider still needs to pay the content providers to use the content. It's not the other way around. It almost never is. In this context, only the content provider, not the service provider, is involved in ad scheduling. So you couldn't really then say, I want to transmit ads to a local market segment. It's only national or network-wide markets. Prior works that we found lacked UE feedback. We didn't have any information saying, who's watching this video? How do we allocate resources? Why should we allocate more resources to the home shopping network if no one's watching it? This is where feedback is required. Prior works lacked a game theoretic analysis. Thus, the system was unable to automatically adapt to viewer behavior. So now we can see game theory comes into play when we want to analyze how to respond to rational behavior. Now, what if we wanted to support ad-supported TV or eMBMS? Essentially, you as an end consumer doesn't pay for TV. Instead, the advertisers pay for their advertisements to be broadcast. And possibly the service provider pays the content provider. In this context, what does this look similar to? In today's context, this is very similar to essentially YouTube. How does YouTube work? The same thing. Advertisers essentially pay YouTube to use their service. YouTube does not actually have their own videos typically. They depend on content creators that may get paid some money by YouTube. So it's the same model we have for YouTube actually. And we as an end consumer, we only need to suffer through some advertisements, such as watching something on YouTube and some annoying ad you can't skip. But it's essentially free for us, just time. So if we wanted to achieve this in a mobile TV context, essentially we have to add a TV service resource manager that would say, collect user statistics, as in who's watching what, from each of the UEs, and forward these to an advertisement optimizer and service provider. Why does an advertiser care about who's watching their advertisement? Because it tells them how large their market is, and it tells the service provider how much to charge them. The ENO-B would just execute MBMS counting request. This is actually default. This behavior already exists in LTE networks, essentially counting requests saying what subscription, what service you're listening to or subscribing to. And the user equipment, as in your cell phone, would simply reply saying, I'm watching this MBMS program. That's it. The service provider would then perform resource allocation based on viewership. Obviously, if we allocate more resources to, let's say, a very popular or unhomed functional inside, then obviously it will increase viewership. People watch it for longer. Better video, less stuttering, less reason to change the channel. And it increases the viewership for the advertisers and revenue. And the service provider would then schedule TV programs and advertisements based on this viewership information. This advertisement optimizer, which we've added, will actually then forward the viewership information to the advertisers to say who's watching it. Obviously, you're an advertiser. You want to make sure people are watching your advertisements. Google Analytics does something similar for what's currently out there right now. Who's watching your pages? We use valuations from each advertiser to run an auction based on each advertiser's preference. Is this auction complicated? No. In fact, I'm sure many of you have already have participated in auctions in the past. Since you make a bid, and if someone outbids you, you get nothing. If no one outbids you, then you pay either that price or the second bidder's price, or something similar. This sends this advertising allocation based off this auction, and it bids from the advertisers to the service provider. So first auction off your advertisements, then send to the service provider to schedule, and charge back his advertisers. What does this require though? Real time, once again. This cannot be pre-done. It's not like Super Bowl. Typical TV programs require real-time statistics and feedback, not just empty hard solutions. And advertisers have a different valuation per viewer. So let's say people that people that would say broadcast, or companies that want to broadcast their content on Super Bowl, value users more than someone that wants to broadcast their ads to, let's say, a midnight showing of something, or some TV program. And this valuation, every ad slot valuation would depend on the viewership or expected number of people that would see it. So obviously, if you're a political candidate, you want to increase your viewership because it increases exposure and you want to pay more. And these preferences, such as ad duration, number of advertisements, and TV programs, actually lead to a matching between advertisers and which TV programs and ad slots exist. Now, the content provider would then send the TV programs and the advertisements to the content network. So we haven't gotten into any very difficult game theory concepts yet, and we'll try to avoid those, but here we can actually see this as being a Stackelberg game. If you haven't heard this before, just think of this as a stage game. You have multiple stages. One stage finishes, and then you can start the second stage. And you can use reverse induction to go ahead and say how to rationalize and optimize my strategy based on what the next player will do. So for this game structure, we see the first game is actually a voting game. Voting because, say, I'm watching which TV program now? Is it ABC, NBC, MSN, Fox? It's like voting, just like that. And then the advertisement allocation game saying which advertisers want to bid for which slot based on how much they have and how much they value each user. So we now see the voting that our UEs use can influence the prices that advertisers are willing to pay. Now, the benefit of this is voting doesn't just impact advertisers' funding, advertisers' cost. It also lets us optimize. It also lets us know the size of each multicast group. This can let us then optimize our resources and say allocate more resources to a channel that has more viewers, and less resources to a channel that has fewer viewers. This lets us maximize our user engagement concept again. Now the buffer ratio, once again, increases 1%, decreases engagement 3.7 minutes, and the result is decreases revenue from advertisers because they will know how many people will approximately see their advertisement. So obviously we have an incentive, not just increase quality of experience for the end user, but maximizing the overall system quality of experience also maximizes our potential revenue. Okay? And so this simplified utility function actually, we can actually use an exponential fit version for simulation, but for a simple explanation here, we can see that a simple linear relationship can explain how we as humans actually respond to buffering ratios and bit rates. Now, what does this translate to in terms of resource allocation? So, what we could do is just use a very simple concept of proportional. A proportional fair resource allocation scheme. So here, if we assume the number of resource blocks we want to assign to a TV channel T, if we assume the NRB is the number of resource blocks we assign to TV channel T, then we'd say what's a guaranteed bit rate we want to assign. This guaranteed bit rate here corresponds to our base layer video. This says at what point we will not have buffering events. And everything above that is just a proportional fair resource allocation. And now what does this proportion actually correspond to is how many votes are for one channel over the sum of all votes over all channels. So you can see by essentially determining which resources, which people are watching, or which UEs are watching which groups, we can then maximize resources in a proportionally fair manner. and the number of guaranteed resource blocks is dependent upon our guaranteed bit rate, which is our video coding determined, or source video coding determined, divided by our resource block capacity. So we can see now we've put together all the pieces of video coding, resource block allocation, and voting, just for maximizing QoE of a video stream. Now, what does the actual voting game do? So all UEs watching TV channels are players. See, or what does a vote mean? You vote for a TV channel, you get more resources. But what if you vote for more channels than just one? What's the impact? This requires we analyze it. So strategies we can have is essentially to do not vote. Do not vote essentially is no feedback. This actually is not a good resource allocation scheme. We can't optimize based off that. Voting for a single channel seems reasonable. We can say, I vote for CNN or NBA or TNT. Or we can vote for multiple channels. I think, okay, what if I vote for all channels? What does that do? Is voting for all channels actually better for me? Well, not necessarily. So actually, the utility function here is that we can actually see this as trying to optimize is percent of viewers times utility of the video itself. So obviously, all right. Some basic assumptions we need here before we proceed is how many TV channels can you watch at one time? Now, this actually has a relatively simple answer. Based off digital rights management, you're typically restricted to watching one channel at a time, and you can't record it. So assume there's no concept of essentially digital video recording, it's all live TV, and one channel at a time. So in this context, you could say, fine, you vote for multiple channels, but unless you're going back and forth between two channels, it doesn't help. So the goal of the user equipment is to maximize resource allocation or maximize utility. This effectively increases the bit rate, decreases the buffering events, increases the number of layers, and increases the QoE. That's at least the effect on the UE. Now, in terms of resource allocation, what does this actually mean? So, let's say I vote for every channel. You know, this is the typical NBMS behaviors. Typically, if you can receive a service, you say you're receiving it. So the default behavior is all vote. But you say you're receiving the NBMS service. So it's not very intelligent. If we look at all vote here, this blue square, you can see it actually doesn't result in the best utility. Your engagement is actually one of the lowest. The only one that's slightly lower is not voting at all. That's because there's no feedback. You can't really allocate resources between channels without feedback. Now, what if we actually had multiple votes, voting for 2 channels or 3 versus just 1? That actually results in a suboptimal resource allocation because you can only watch 1 channel at a time. So our best strategy to maximize voting, to maximize our resource allocation is to only permit voting for a single channel. So I'll give you another example. Okay, in recent elections, not the Kaohsiung, but that's a good one. But if you look at let's say U.S. president elections, Trump versus Biden, think, okay, do you vote for one candidate? Do you vote for 2? Let's ignore, is it legal? Let's say you can vote for as many as you want. Does voting for 2 candidates, does it actually help? No. Because only one person can actually be president. So really, the best way to maximize your payoff is to vote for only one. And we can see this actually is a similar concept here. It's the same concept in politics and as we see here in this voting for TV channels. And actually, if we look at number of layers, average number of layers, you can see that voting for a single TV channel, the one you're interested in, maximizes the number of video layers you receive. So it's higher video quality. So now for this, we assume there's a fixed MCS. The reason we did is because typical mobile TV doesn't really, it can't adjust based off everyone's different channel conditions. It needs to have a fixed coding scheme. It's unavoidable. And we assume there's 5 channels that are being allocated. And the dominant strategy just said was voting once. The maximum utility was 10 seconds. So essentially, as the number of votes per channel increases, we can see that we actually approach our maximum user engagement of 10 seconds. Now, what if we consider how this voting actually impacts advertisements? Okay, voting for a TV station and advertisements, what's the connection? Advertisers will pay if they know you're watching. And if they know the dominant strategy is to vote for a single channel, then they know that when they see that there's an expected number of viewers for a TV channel, that essentially that represents the number of people that will watch their advertisement. So this strategy then is to, for advertisers, is to bid up to the reported valuation dependent on reported viewership from the first stage, or voting game. So obviously, if we can let the advertisers trust our numbers, and because we have a single voting strategy, the advertisers will bid up to their reported valuation, or maximum they're willing to bid. If we don't report this information, we don't tell advertisers how many people are watching an ad, you will get a lower profit as a service provider, because they will not trust your numbers. And now we can see this as essentially saying, for a 2-minute break, how many possible time slots are there? If we assume advertisements can start at any 15-second interval, and you have 30 seconds, and each advertisement can be 30 seconds long, then there's 7 potential slots, advertising slots we can actually assign, whether 30 seconds or 15 seconds. So what does this sound like? Once again, knapsack. Now, the allocation of advertising slots actually results in a winner determination problem. For those of you interested in game theory, winner determination problems have a reputation for being NP hard. Viewership space that we consider for this, essentially a set of channel viewership statistics used for valuation estimates for the TV program. So obviously as the QE, or quality of experience, goes up, the viewership, the viewership decreasing, the viewership decreases slower. It means people will watch the TV program longer. So more people will watch your advertisements by having a higher QE for the TV program itself. The effect is increased profit. Now, what's the computational complexity? Now, actually, we can compute this by using gradients once again. We can compute this in polynomial time. So the first stage, which is our winner determination problem, has big O of NB bidders, these are advertisers. And the auction essentially is essentially IML, or price of difference. Maximum. Essentially, this is indicating number of indifference curves, or points where people will stop bidding. So you only bid up to your maximum valuation. Once you have to pay your maximum valuation for an object, you enter a point of being indifferent to whether or not you get it, because you don't save money. Why should I care about getting an object if I pay the maximum price for it? So effectively, this says that our total runtime can be number of difference curves divided by our step increase multiplied by number of bidders. What's this? It's just a polynomial time function. Once again, it's not NP hard actually. Now, let's say here we have for each advertisement slot, we have a different valuation, a different estimate for viewership. Now, if we assumed we had different estimation for viewership, then we could say that reporting heterogeneous slots, every slot has a different viewership number. We actually have a higher profit than if we reported every slot has the same viewership numbers. So obviously, advertisers may turn off viewers, but we're still talking about interest in the TV program based on video quality. Now, obviously, then we want to ask, what if we permitted voting for every channel versus just voting for one channel? If we vote for every channel, such as here, we actually have a lower profit than voting for a single channel. So you can see the advertisers will pay more. The advertisers will be willing to pay more money if numbers actually provide differentiation among the TV channels and slots. So effectively, by providing a dominant strategy scheme and a polynomial time execution scheme, we can say we can use advertisers to pay for advertisements and subsidize or pay for the TV service to be enabled. So the service provider will now say, I can expect money from mobile TV, so why don't I enable it? So the whole point of this research was essentially saying how we can convince the advertisers to pay for it and enable our MBMS services. Now let's see. So our next work essentially is LADTRAM. This is my third work. It's dealing with D2D advertisements. So essentially, D2D is a very interesting creature. It says your mobile device can talk to any other mobile device and not go through the service provider. So as an end consumer, you think this is a great thing. I don't need to worry about going to the service provider and send all the data I want. Problem is, service provider can't earn money from this. By enabling this service, they actually can lose money because service providers typically charge you based on the amount of data you send. I'm assuming here this isn't $2. It's not like $2. It's actually, they charge you based on data amounts. In the US, they do this. They make it very unpleasant when they charge like 10 cents per kilobyte or some such thing. So for this work, we actually use D2D-based advertisements. This requires non-collocated multi-carrier support, essentially someone that provides a spectrum for D2D transmissions shouldn't be the one that's charging for them. So, now who has been to the US? Someone. And this is actually a real question, not just, are you asleep? Come on. All right, one person. Okay. I'll try a different one. Who has been to Linkou? Sanjin. Or, as a kid over and you want, can't want it. Sorry. I've been in Taipei too long. But essentially, this mall structure you see here is a common structure that you see in these premium shopping malls. Now, the Great Mall, located in Milpitas, California, actually was an old auto factory. So you would see it look like a big manufacturing site, but really it's now just converted to a big mall. Say, okay. Now, how does D2D relate to this? Well, typically one thing that malls do is when you enter them, they hand out these flyers saying where sales are, who's selling what. What's on, like for example, you go to Kohl's or Marshall's, Burlington. I don't know if Kohl's still exists. Well, in the past it existed. So essentially, they hand out these flyers saying what's for sale. Now, this seems nice and everything, but it actually presents an e-waste problem. You have all of like wasted advertising papers, and it's not efficient. Also, it doesn't permit real-time or 临时广告. You'll have pre-plan it. Now, actually, what can we use D2D for is free mobile advertising. So stores or advertisers could sponsor this D2D service. So D2D is not the same as NBMS. D2D has a much smaller range. So we can transmit in localized spectrums. The benefit of this is we can reuse the spectrum over and over and over again. So typically, NBMS services are for one entire cell. That could be 2 kilometers of area. But for D2D, you can limit it, maybe 30 meters, 100 meters, much shorter. So in this context, we could say, okay, here's this mouse here, fine. So we could say, let's say people come in through this entrance here. What store are they interested in? Typically, they're interested in the stores here or around here. So you only need to transmit advertisements for stores around this entrance. And as they walk around the mall, they get more advertisements until they reach this point, where they get more advertisements for this section. So it's a very natural application of using D2D to transmit advertisements for free. The benefit of this is it's saved on paper, and the service provider can reuse spare spectrum. So typically, people in the mall setting won't be playing with their cell phone non-stop. They'll be shopping. So why do you want to waste your radio spectrum when people will be using it? If you use it for D2D, you can monetize or make money from the spare idle spectrum. So there is a natural application of this. So D2D actually is unlikely to generate revenue for the service provider. Reason being, they can't measure how much data is transmitted. They don't know the capacity between 2 devices. There's no information saying, let's say, my cell phone and your cell phone have some channel quality. They don't know. It doesn't matter. The service provider can't care less. They just know how many resource blocks, how many chunks of spectrum they allocate you. So the solution is, how can we enable localized subsector spectrum auctions via D2D? Say subsector, what does it sound like? Cognitive radio, right? Okay. Cognitive radio, I guess, maybe wrong department. So spectrum reuse essentially says you can form a coalition. So if you've sold the spectrum many times over, you can say, all right, I as a small business don't have enough money to transmit advertisements over an entire network cell. But I just need a small amount of data for limited space. So what if I work with other stores in my area and we combine our resources together, form a coalition, and then use a subsector of spectrum. Essentially just use a smaller chunk of the spectrum just for transmitting our advertisements. The benefit of this is small businesses cannot use what's essentially a very expensive resource because they're sharing it. So D2D actually, I'll put it this way. On your cell phone, you talk to a base station via a UU interface. So this UU interface is how essentially you transmit data to a service provider. And PC5 or Sidelink is how you talk with D2D. Now, if you've studied LTE or license, LTE license shared access, this concept, it's actually, this concept actually is supported by 3GPP and actually is a concept that's been used for many years now. If you have an incumbent spectrum user, say, okay, I have spectrum that I'm not using, and I want to make money off it by loaning it to someone else. what they can do is say this spectrum is available and put it in this LSA repository. And this LSA repository can then say which portions of the spectrum are available, what are the conditions of its use, and then they can send this over to an LSA controller that can then transmit these LSA bands to a LSA licensee that can then update the LSA repository saying, I'm using this. So the net effect is you can essentially lease out your spectrum to someone else. Now, is this concept new? No, actually, MVNOs, mobile virtual network operators, actually use this concept over and over again. Who has heard of Cricket Mobile? Cricket? Okay. Let me think. Is there another mobile network provider? Well, I'll put it this way. Some mobile network providers in the US don't actually own the infrastructure that your cell phone talks to. They just lease it. And they use this concept to essentially lease it and the services from someone else. And that's not the computer, that's actually this thing. What happened? Look at that, see? I thought I was possessed by something. Okay. So, obviously, if you're a mobile virtual network operator, you don't have the resources, you don't have the equipment, you have to loan it from someone, lease it from someone else. And actually, this is a way that you can see essentially these small niche markets like even Metro PCS. I don't know if you've heard of that, but Metro PCS is another mobile virtual network operator in the US. They actually lease their spectrum, I think, from Sprint. You can actually look at their coverage map and figure out what they use. So for LTE, LSA, so typically spectrum auctions, typically radio spectrum auctions that governments run are for long-term assignments, such as multiple years. But LTE, LSA actually says you can run a spectrum auction or allocate spectrum to a sector or geographic region. If you've dealt with white space resource allocation, you'll see this again and again. Subsector allocations require service provider involvement because the service provider owns the base station and its localized spectrum to that base station. The service provider cannot not be involved. They must be involved. But as of this research, there was no framework for resale of spectrum from a licensee. Localized spectrum auctions or advertiser, the advertiser only uses a subset of resource blocks is actually what this research work was about. So I've used here China Telecom as an example because it's a very easy to find icon on the internet. So typically, the end users such as you, me, your cousin, we're primary users. We essentially just use spectrum from our mobile provider. And then the service, then that can actually be auctioned off again to MVNOs or essentially spectrum auctions to secondary users. And these secondary users can then auction them off again to tertiary users. So in this research we said, why don't we just expand on this idea of spectrum auctions and say, not just primary users, not just secondary users, but support tertiary users or small businesses that want to transmit their store information in a localized spectrum that's been sold to secondary users by a service provider in that base station. So in this case, each ADV down here represents a demand curve saying how many resources I need. Each ad station represents a set of resource blocks that it can use. So ad stations are essentially transmitting in localized spectrum. And MGMT actually runs this game between the ad stations. So these ad stations, they're not competing with each other. They're actually cooperating. It's a coalition for them. Combine their resources together and incentivize the service provider to enable the service. But for this structure to work, the service provider needs to own the ad stations, or locations of the ad stations, and MGMT, the one that runs the game. Reason being is otherwise you get a situation where you end up having essentially intermediary fees being deducted by third parties. Essentially, if management is a contractor working for the service provider, they may take all the money from the game. So for this, we simply said, assume that ad stations and management are combined, are both actually controlled by a service provider. You know what? I knew there was a reason I wrote this as PowerPoint. I didn't know there were transitions here. So, in this context, the service provider would then send the supply curve saying how much spectrum is available. How much spectrum is available? It would send this supply curve to management. And management would say, the management would essentially say, how far each ad station wants to transmit. So obviously we don't want an ad station to transmit too far because it'll end up interfering with other ad stations. And we don't want it to transmit too short distance because then it ends up interfering with, and it doesn't transmit the entire area. And then this ad station would say, based off the distance you want me to transmit, what's the appropriate MCS I should use? What we care about MCS is because it has direct impact on the resources we can use. Higher MCS, higher density resource blocks. So obviously we can transmit more ads. And let's see. Then each advertiser would send their demand and a bid to management saying, I want to send, let's say, an advertisement with 100 bytes and how much I'm going to pay for it. So management would then say, okay, I know which ad station you want to transmit at. I don't know how much you want. I know how much you want to pay, how many resources you want, how much you want to pay, and how many resources are available. Then management here would actually run an auction and determine demand curves and costs, saying how much should you pay for those resources based on the demands we have. So obviously, if there's more advertisers, it can increase our revenue because they'll compete. If there's fewer advertisers, then we only have the reserve price. Then management would then actually send this winning allocation to each of the ad stations, saying, okay, which advertisers should you transmit in your localized spectrum? Then based off this, the ad station would transmit to local UEs, saying, let's say, Gap is having a sale, let's say, BB clothes or something. And then the UE sends back an acknowledgement saying, I received that ad. The UE is not saying, I want to pay money. The UE only says, I essentially have received this ad. It essentially says, I've been impacted by it. Now you can charge the advertiser accordingly. Then this ad station sends a receipt of how many people received this ad to management. Management then says, okay, so someone received your advertisement, and how much should you pay now? So essentially, this is a post-payment process, not pre-payment. And then the advertiser needs to pay management. So as you can see, effectively, the advertisers pay only based on the number of people that receive the advertisement. Because obviously, you can't expect an advertiser to pay if no one receives it. Just like we have TV ads that say number of impacts, and Google has with YouTube. With DTD ads, you can't expect someone to pay for it if no one receives it. So each advertiser's goal is essentially to maximize their valuation, or maximize how much they actually save. So how much you're willing to pay minus the price they pay for it. So in this case, their strategies are to report their valuation and demand size. So I report a higher valuation, says I'm willing to pay more for my demand. Each DTD ad station then tries to maximize the bandwidth of the ad station. So in this case, say, how do I essentially maximize my bandwidth of the ad station, or how much I can carry, and how many people can receive it? As in, how do I determine the MCS? And management determines the optimal auction size. This is a per advertiser demand, saying how much, essentially, how much each advertiser needs to pay, or how many resources they need based on their bit demand divided by their resource block capacity. And then based on this, it runs an auction for the supply curve being here resource blocks, and then the ad station's winning allocation is determined. So once again, this is a stage game that says, this is a ad resource allocation game. It says determine your MCS. The resource manager would then say, for this determined MCS, set your transmission distance, and let's say 5 meters. Ad station would then determine what MCS corresponds to that, a virtual UE, and then we transmit this back to the ad station, to the management unit. Now the question would be, what would be the incentive to, let's say, report a higher MCS? Well, okay, you report a higher MCS, what does it mean? If you report a higher MCS, essentially means you can carry more advertisements. But it also means you have a smaller coverage area. You may not have the same impact of users. Because a higher MCS says you have to be closer to receive it. You have to have a better signal quality. And actually, this can be done just by projecting our MCS. So this is a virtual UE here. So if we first measure the noise floor with all DTDs being silent, this would correspond to average white Gaussian noise. Then we can measure what the noise is with static interference due to other stations or jamming. So obviously, if the stations are far enough apart, then they don't significantly impact each station. Then determine the path loss from our DTD ad station to the virtual UE. Then project the SNR based off this information, such as interference and noise and path loss, and determine the required MCS to successfully receive an ad based on this virtual UE location. So theoretically, it says we're trying to reverse engineer this equation to determine what MCS corresponds to the SINR based off our projected path loss, ambient noise, and interference noise. So the ad station allocation game essentially says if the MCS is higher than that of the edge, as in we have a higher bit density or capacity than that of the edge, we get 0. Because our edge users can't receive our messages. They can't decode them. But what if it's equal or lower than? Then we say it's bandwidth. It's whatever it's this BWM, which is resource blocks times F of MCS. This BW here means bit rate, not actually bandwidth in terms of frequency. So effectively it says how to maximize this, but avoid being overzealous and sending too much information. Let's see. So actually, all this here just represents the repeat over and over again. So in this ad station option, essentially the service provider would then send its supply curve and place the per station bids for each particular advertiser. Now each station here, or each management entity would then say, what's the MCS of the station? What is the number of bids for that station? And how do I set the price? Now, if we use a sequential, if we use a decrementing supply sequential clock auction, essentially it says we decrease our supply until we get the number of, until we essentially determine the allocation of resources that maximizes our efficiency. Effectively, what this says is, what decrementing supply sequential clock auction effectively says is, we want to determine how to allocate our resources in the most efficient manner possible, i.e. allocate resources to those that value them the most. Now for an MCS-dependent auction, actually this is also this is a particular auction we discussed earlier. Is the ads are sorted by their per resource block valuation, and we assume there's n winners. The allocation rule is winners are allocated in order of per resource block valuation. So essentially, winners are allocated resource blocks sequentially. So those that have higher valuation for more resource blocks get more first. The price rule is essentially demand in resource blocks times resource block valuation of last winner is essentially how much you're charged. Now, for game theory and auctions in general, this pricing rule is very important. It says you're not being charged how much you value that resource block. You're being charged the price of the bidder right under you in terms of pricing. That way you have no incentive to tell us you don't value it as much, because you will never pay. You will never pay more than you value. In the worst case, the person below you in terms of valuation is the same as yours. So you pay most of your valuation. Now, because of this pricing rule and allocation rule, essentially it results in a dominant strategy incentive compatible auction. It says people will be willing to tell the truth about how much they want and how much they're willing to pay. It permits individual rationality, as you only pay if you win. If we charge people for entry into this auction, then it wouldn't be individually rational. it's allocatively efficient on per resource block valuation. So this effectively says, if you value resource block more, you can get that resource block. Now, from a proof standpoint, instead of going through all the math formulas here, which may not go so well, we essentially said, what are the cases we need to consider? Well, if you report a lower demand than your actual demand, what happens? You move your resource blocks, but it's not enough to transmit your advertisement, so it's not worth it to you. So you report a demand that's at least as much as your actual demand. Now, what if you report demand higher than your actual demand? Well, let's say you win. And you've paid for resources you won't use. So that's not incentive compatible. What if you report a valuation lower than your actual valuation? Well, all right, you're not actually being charged how much you value it. You're being charged the second bidder's valuation. What could happen? Well, you could still win, your price would be the same, or you could lose. Well, if you report a higher valuation than your actual valuation, well, you could win, but if you're charged more than your actual valuation, then you have negative utility and you wouldn't do that. It wouldn't be rational. So because there's no point in underbidding, overbidding, or underdemanding, or overdemanding, we can see that demand and valuation are accurate. This is a strategy-proof auction. So in this case, we then go back to the first stage and say, okay, what happens here? Well, so MCS, modulation encoding scheme, corresponds to your coverage area. Higher MCS means higher capacity per resource block, but smaller coverage area. And so essentially, the MCS is proportional to the inverse of the area. Now, as MCS goes down, your utility goes down. And since our goal here is to require that you actually can reach the edge of your coverage area, you will report an accurate MCS. Thus, there'll be no incentive to essentially use more, to provide more resources than you can actually effectively use for end users. Now, for this game, we can say its desirable properties are its dominant strategy, incentive compatible. From a uniform price option, it's uniform price because resource blocks all increase the same price at the same time. And MCS selection is dominant in strategy, incentive compatible as well. It exhibits individual rationality as there's no penalty from losing. You lose, so what? You don't lose any money, you just don't win. It's not like a duple where you lose and you actually lose money. And it's budget balance. So budget balance is an essential property of a sustainable system. I'll have a little deviation from this talk here. So if, let's say, a government is subsidizing some commodity, then it's not budget balanced. It says there is someone that's adding money to the system to ensure that something's done. Now, in the US government actually subsidizes growing corn. By growing corn, essentially, it causes farmers to grow corn because by the US government incentivizing people to grow corn by giving them money, essentially causes more corn than is expected. So if you've ever been to US, you'll find, let's say, soda. Coca-Cola, for example, in the US uses corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup. But if you go to Mexico, it uses sugar cane. Is it because high fructose corn syrup is cheaper? No. It's because after it's been subsidized, it's cheaper. So that's an example of how budget balance actually doesn't exist for corn commodities. But for this structure, for a service provider, for them to actually justify this mechanism, it needs to be self-sustainable based off the advertisers, how much they bring to the service provider, and there's no cost to the service provider that's incurred from other than providing services. So there's no money from or to the mechanism. There's no 中介的概念. So no one taking money saying, "Oh, give me half your first month's of rent from the person renting the place and the landlord trying to rent it." That doesn't exist here. This is just balances in income and expenses. Now, VCG is another auction concept. It's called Vickery Clark Groves. It's actually a knapsack auction. Knapsack auctions are nice because they are actually optimal, but they also can be hard. It looks at all possible allocations and is actually computationally complex. With this MCS-dependent auction, it allocates resource blocks to the advertiser who values them the most, but it's polynomial time. In fact, it's n log n. For profit performance, we'll see in a moment that MCS-dependent auction that we derived here is actually similar to VCG. VCG, as a point of fact, for those of you interested in game theory, VCG auctions are rarely used in practice because it's too complex to explain the rules of pricing. It's too complex to explain the rules of pricing to the winners or advertisers in this case. So VCG, the way it works is the price you're charged is determined by the negative externality that you cause to others. Essentially, the cost of lost opportunity that your bid causes others to have to endure. So you see, you may not understand what I said, but my point essentially is it's not simple to say the price you're charged is based off the price everyone else values it as. It's not easy to explain that way. So for simulation, we see here is D2D power based on 3 GPPs set to 23 dBm. For standard base stations, it's around 30 dB. I assume here 10 megahertz downlink spectrum, or 50 resource blocks. The surrounding D2D ad stations act as static interference, which is a fair assumption based off worst case. Free space path loss, which is also another fair assumption. If you think about malls, if you have overhead installations, these are considered line of sight. There's no obstructions between you and, let's say, the camera that's watching you in that store. It can see you just like a ad station could. UEs uniformly distribute within 5 meters of, let's say, an ad station. I use 5 meters here because typically a mall doesn't have a lot of space from one wall to the next. 10 meters is a good assumption. You can adjust this, but for this research, we assume there's 5 meters radius. And we assume valuation was proportional to demand. So if we see here, let's say we used VCG auctions. That's this red line here. VCG is very similar to MCS. So let's say we assumed we'd signed 0.5% of the spectrum for subspectrum auctions. VCG has very similar performance to MCS dependent. Then if we increase the spectrum to be, let's say, 1%, then this becomes essentially very similar performance as well. So as the number of advertisers, as the number of ad stations increase, the stack interference increases, but we can still see in all scenarios that MCS is similar to VCG in terms of auctions. Now what about per UE profits for the service provider? So if we use VCG, while we are slightly higher from a per UE profit perspective, it's also more practical from a real-time perspective. So 这样子我们可以看那个 MCS dependent auction 其实可以带出一个精细演算法，所以不要那么硬的 MP 那个 VCG. So this approximation algorithm, MCS MCS-dependent auction can achieve similar results to that of VCG. Now, what if we look at aggregate service provider profits? Well, this is where it becomes interesting. If we limit the space of our spectrum to, let's say, 3 meters, to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, this effectively means, let's say we limit our UEs to be within 3 meters, this is 4, this is 5. You can see as the UEs increase past 5 meters in terms of distribution, effectively MCS and VCG have a similar performance. Now, what if we look at the intersite distance between ad stations? Well, if we want to support, let's say, 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 ad stations, if we want to reuse the spectrum entirely, we need to make sure that intersite distance is actually at a minimum about 120 meters. Then we can avoid this interference between ad stations. And so with this work, we actually discussed how we can use approximation algorithms, which is computer science, and game theory to essentially reallocate sub-sector spectrum for D2D advertisements. Why is this important? Because D2D, which is a very important technology for 4G and 5G, will require that the service provider is willing to enable it. So all the works we've seen here are essentially MDMS, D2D, and how to convince a service provider that yes, you can profit off of this. Actually, I think that's probably all the time we have for this presentation.这样就会交还给这位教授。
好，那不好意思耽误了大家的时间。那很感谢就是克拉菲老师，然后让我们就是介绍一下他之前做过的一些研究的一些成果这样子。那如果有人，因为我知道有一些人是做类似的东西，那或许你有兴趣可以留下来问问看，就是柯老师的一些研究的一些想法和成果。我觉得这个东西应该有一些人在做了，特别是5G， 有人在做 Multicast。我知道，就我认识，蛮多做网络的老师有在做这一块东西。那你有兴趣可以留下来问问看，然后有可能你的演算法不是那么的有 theoretical 部分，你不是那么会分析，那或许你需要的是一个近似演算法啦，或者是你需要的是一个game theory based 的演算法，那你就可以留下来问问看说，你应该看哪一些 paper， 然后来让你的东西做得更好这样子。因为有时候东西就是少了这个，你就会做得很差啦，看起来就是 simulation， 然后也没有什么东西，就单纯这样比。那有时候很难去被认可，说你对这个实际的网络是有贡献的。好，那希望这个对大家来说还是有一些帮助，有一些刺激。至少你看到有些名词啊什么的，你回去可能查一查 paper 或什么，就会有一些想法。好，那大概是这样。有人想要问问题的吗？我想时间超过，可能应该不太会有人想问。那没关系，那你可以就是结束之后留下来问。好，那我们就在这边就结束了这样子。好，那最后给老师一个掌声。